Hello, this lecture is going to be on Ghana and the Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire in French. And you also have a supplementary video on Burkina Faso and the Bois. So let me go ahead and share my screen. One moment. So again, starting out with this map of Africa, last week we looked at Mali, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Today, we're going to look at the Côte d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast, as well as Ghana. Here's Burkina Faso. So we're going to start with Ghana and move to the Ivory Coast. So starting in Luna, about Ghana, the people group that we're going to be looking at primarily today are the Ashanti. And they're a subgroup of the larger linguistic group, which is called Akan. The Ashanti are matrilineal, so heritage goes through the mother rather than through the father. There are 14 states, and each is ruled by a head chief. And there's one chief who's paramount, who's over all the other chiefs and all of the states. And this ruler is called the Asantehene. The Asantehene plays an important role in politics today. This position is inherited through matrilineal lines, so again, through the mother's heritage rather than the father's, and the position serves to link the past with the present. So one thing that you noticed in the video on the Ashanti and the Asantehene and the golden stool was there were lots of swords in the images, and you can also see swords in these images here. So, and I'm going to talk about swords and ceremonial objects that are processed or part of a procession in a little bit later in this movie. But you can see again here these ceremonial swords. And the swords are very important. So the article that you are looking at on Ghana talks about swords. Lesser chiefs own 6 swords, whereas the Asantehene owns 19. Okay, so again, you can see here, I believe the lesser chiefs and the Asantehene, and the golden stool is located next to the Asantehene. And I'll come back to the golden stool in just a moment. So again, this is just to give you an idea of what these processions look like and how royalty is presented in the Ashanti society. So moving forward, I'm going to talk specifically about stools. So stools have a very important role in the Ashanti society. These are important personal items, and they are created for a specific individual, and they take on that individual's aura, as it were. You do not sit on another person's stool. It is uniquely and individually theirs. It's not something that you would use or mess with. In fact, when someone gets up and leaves the room to do something, they turn their stool over on its side, typically, so it cannot be sat upon. These take on the spiritual properties of their owners, like I said, the aura, and they are carved by male blacksmiths. So again, right, this idea of the people who are able to control and manipulate the power that is in all things. So the Nyama for the Bamana, or the Hail for the Mende peoples, right? So again, we see this blacksmith comes into play. These are typically made from one piece of wood, and it's typically a central column that has holes of some sort and 4 supporting columns. It also has this sloping saddle seat, which is quite comfortable, but you can also put it over the back of your neck and drape your arms over it to carry it. So this is something that would be taken with a person and moved around with them. So this is not a static piece of furniture that stays in one area. So for instance, you know, my office chair stays here. It doesn't move around. That is absolutely not what we're seeing here. And again, this is a very individualized thing. So the central column here in the center symbolizes the king, but also the sun when it's at its height. And the seat is essentially the face of this. The column is the neck and the base is the body. The holes that you see in the central column are symbolic of the voice, right? So they are often associated with a proverb, and names for stools can be drawn from these proverbs. And again, you have 4 columns, like I mentioned, which reference the 4 cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. Everyone has at least one stool. Both of these objects are in the DIA, the Detroit Institute of Arts. And there is a hierarchy to these stools. So you have what's known as the white stool, and this is an ordinary stool. It's usually a natural wood color. So both of the stools that we're looking at now are white stools. A silver stool is a white stool that is covered or plated with silver. And this is used by queen mothers and paramount chiefs. And then finally, you have the golden stool, which is a white stool. So again, a stool like this, covered with gold. And this is reserved for the king. And this is not the golden stool. It is a golden stool used by the Ashantahini. And stools for royalty would be made by the Royal Guild. When someone dies, it is possible that if they are important enough, their stool will be preserved, right? So again, I mentioned that it is imbued with some of the aura, some of the spiritual properties of the person who owned it. So if the owner of a silver or a gold stool, so one that's been plated in silver or gold, dies under certain circumstances, it can be, it's called blackened after death, and this serves to commemorate it. So in order to have your stool blackened, you need to be someone who merits, right, a silver or a gold stool. So you have to have a certain social standing. You have to die of natural causes or old age while still ruling. So you can't die of disease, accident, suicide, homicide. You have to have been considered moral and upstanding, a good leader for the community. All of these things are necessary. So this process, this blackening process, involves applying a patina to these stools. So the patina is charcoal soot mixed with egg whites and spider webs, specifically spider webs because spiders are considered wise. And so this is rubbed onto the stool, right? So we've talked about this application of the patina, specifically with things like the Bamana Komokun or the Bamana Boli. Okay, so it's a similar sort of idea. It involves, it can also involve blood and saliva, and it's black because that looks better with the patina. And there is an official chief who acts as the keeper of the stools. And there's a room devoted to stools, and only the chief, who is the keeper of stools, is allowed to enter. They maintain the ritual sacrifices that honor the souls that embody these stools, and they must be barefoot whenever they enter the space because it is a sacred space. So this idea of being barefoot in a sacred space is common across religions. You see it in Christianity, for instance, with Moses in the burning bush, where he's told to remove his sandals by the bush that burns without burning up, because he is on holy ground. So it's a similar idea of respect for the sacred. Neither a blackened stool nor a gold stool may touch the ground. Okay, so there has to be some measure of separation between the stool and the ground. So in public, a blackened stool would be placed on a chair but tilted on its side, and this indicates that it is not to be sat upon. And it often will have bells attached, and these bells are used to summon the royal ancestors who are ruling in the afterworld. Apologies. So that's just kind of a basic overview of stools. Again, you can see that a lot of care goes into creating these. These are not simply functional pieces, but they are also beautiful. Stools can be either ready-made or commissioned. Here you see a ceremonial stool. So this one is more elaborate. Although again, even though there are these reptilian sort of creatures, it does still have this idea of the central column with the 4 columns surrounding. So I'm going to talk now about the golden stool. And the golden stool is capital T for the, capital G for golden, capital S for stool. This is a specific stool that is incredibly important. This is not just one of the stools that is gold and is used by one of the kings. So in order to understand the significance of the golden stool, you need to know that the Ashanti states were founded in 1670 in part by Ashantehene Osei Tutu. And their traditional religion involves the golden stool. So Osei Tutu was the ruler from 1680 to 1717, and he used both diplomacy and spiritual power to unite the various groups into this homogeneous 14-state society. So what you're looking at here is the Ashanti chief. Okay, and you can see again the ceremonial objects. We'll talk about the fabric in a few moments, the golden stool is depicted here, which I already zoomed in. So what you see here is the golden stool. Okay, and it is a stool. You can see that it has many of the characteristics that we talked about, the central column with the holes. It is said to be solid gold. And this was created divinely. This is not made by human hands, according to the belief system. So there was an advisor who was a priest. And when Osei Tutu sought to unify all of these groups together into the Ashanti nation, he gathered, the priest gathered chiefs and queen mothers and elders, brought them all together, and then he took pieces of their persons. So things like nail clippings or hair, right? So things that can be removed without serious harm to the individual, but things that would be imbued with their personal power, spirituality, right? So again, think of this concept of nyama. Nyama is the Bhamana concept. So this is different, but it is the same general idea of this power that flows through everything. And so the priest takes all these things from the queens and elders and chiefs, and he puts them into a pot and he boils them together, thereby symbolically and physically and spiritually uniting everyone. And this creates a plume of smoke that goes up to the heavens, and then in the heavens is turned into the golden stool, which falls and lands in Osei Tutu's lap. So characteristics of the golden stool. You can see here, the stool is placed on its side. So again, this is like what we were talking about when you leave a room, you would turn your stool on its side. But like the gold or silver stools or blackened or gold stools, it does not touch the ground. Okay, so what you see here is the embodiment of the soul of the Ashanti nation. And this is seen as more powerful than even the king. Okay, so the Ashantehene is very important, but more important than even the Ashantehene is the golden stool. This is the physical, spiritual symbol, but also the actual substance of the Ashanti nation. It contains the essence of all their leaders. And it is gold, solid gold, and it's the gold represents endurance. So like the sun, it will never die. And the throne on which the golden stool sits is typically a 17th to 18th century Portuguese chair, right? So it is a chair from Europe. It symbolizes that it has power over the Europeans, right? The colonizers. And it's a symbol of health for the Ashanti nation. It has a spirit, and it appears roughly annually. As mentioned with the blackened stools, you can see that there are bells attached to the front, and these bells are used to summon the ancestors who again are ruling in the other world. And when it is presented annually, this is to remind people to have faith in leadership, to reassure the community of the power of the king, all of these things, right? So this is a display of grandeur, but it's also a very heartening display. Think about what it would mean to be able to see once a year the heart of your nation, right? So think about what that could mean. And this is not just patriotism, this is also religious. This is the spiritual embodiment of the Ashanti nation. Okay, so this is a very big deal. And hopefully you watched the video on the golden stool, which covered a lot more than the golden stool, but it talked in that video about how when the colonizers came, the British came in the 19th century, they wanted to subjugate the Ashanti people. They wanted to be able to control the gold trade, right? So Ghana is known for its gold. You can see that there is a lot of gold in the ceremonial objects, right? Everything is covered in gold. There's a lot of gold that is naturally occurring in Ghana. This is the Gold Coast. And so the British came, and the leader of the British, he was very offended that they did not bring out the golden stool for him to see, but also for him to sit on. And he asked a very offensive question saying, "Why have you not brought me the golden stool that I might sit upon it? I am, I'm from Britain and I'm extremely powerful, and why have you not honored me by allowing me to sit on this stool?" So think about how offensive that would be, right? Think about something that has this level of importance. I'm not even sure what that would be for myself, but something that is so, so powerful and spiritually significant and symbolic. And then someone who is seeking to subjugate you and your people wants to sit on it as if it were a common chair. But the Ashanti had hidden the golden stool, and it did not fall into British hands. The Ashanti-Hini Primpe was exiled, but eventually allowed to come back. And eventually the golden stool also came back and dwelt in the Ashanti nation again, because it was safe from the colonizers. So there's a lot of history surrounding this, and hopefully you can understand, or at least begin to understand, why this is so important, and just how important it is to the Ashanti, but also consideration of what it would take in order to think that you deserve to sit on this stool because you are from England, right? So very interesting story, and also very problematic power grabbing incident related to that. So the next thing that I wanted to discuss is processions. So royal art is processed, right? And this looks like the word processed, but it means to process. So think about like a parade or a procession, right? So a procession is more ceremonial. It's less frivolous than a parade. And these royal objects are part of these annual processions. These processions can also happen when a king dies, at the funeral of the king, and also the enstoolement of the next king. So instead of saying enthroned, they say enstooled. right? And you can see why, because stools are so important to them. And as I showed you, right, even the golden stool has its own throne. Okay, so there are also private ceremonies that occur in conjunction with the public ceremonies, because the private ceremonies tend to be more spiritually potent. So for example, when a king dies, the transfer of power occurs in private. So the king, the new king, is lowered 3 times under the old king's stool. They do not use the old king's stool because that belonged solely to the king who is now deceased, but it is a way of conferring the power to rule onto the new ruler, a way of allowing some of the aura to join with the new king. And this is done in private, followed by a public ceremony. And there are a couple of other markers of status that often appear at these processions. So you have various forms of regalia. Let me go forward a little bit here. Yes. You have regalia, specifically you have lots of swords. And so these are ceremonial. There is one in the DIA if you've ever been able to see it. These blades do not look like what we might anticipate a sword would look like. They are more rounded and they are less sharp and less aggressive. You can see here what they look like. And so these are both status symbols as well as part of the treasury. And they're symbolic, not for fighting, but for oath making. A king or a chief can demonstrate their prowess by dancing with these swords. And these are very athletic endeavors that involve juggling would seem to make light of it, but some amount of tossing and twirling and catching the sword while dancing, all of these things combined in order to create a display of skill and athleticism. It's basically a way of the chief being able to show that they are physically capable of being a chief. And another element of these processions is also umbrellas. So you also see a lot of umbrellas, and these have symbolic significance. So the more important someone is, the higher your status, the bigger your object. So the bigger the umbrella, the more important you are. The higher the number of umbrellas, the more important you are. So all of these things come together and indicate social status. As I mentioned, the Ashanti has 19 swords versus 6 for the individual chiefs. Excuse me. So moving on, we're going to look at 2 types of fabric. The first is a dinkra, followed by kente cloth. So this is a dinkra cloth, and this is a formal cloth. It's worn during funerals. It was originally introduced to the Ashanti by a foreign king who was taken prisoner and being held in the Ashanti prison while wearing this type of cloth. And so it is associated with defeat and loss, death, sorrow, all of these things. And it's a cotton cloth that's then stamped with different patterns. And the colors are usually somewhat prescribed, and the stamps are made from a gourd that is dried out and then cut into patterns, then dipped in dye made from boiled tree bark with iron-rich materials, and then it is stamped on the fabric. So again, this is not to make light of it at all, but just to kind of give you an idea of what this might be like. If you ever used a potato and carved into it, then use that to make stamps. It's a similar sort of process in terms of the actual materials of making the stamps. But again, this is not frivolous. These cloths are, they tend to be rather somber. They have traditionally been kept for royalty, worn by grandchildren of the king, the keeper of the stools, and the keeper of the sandals while the king is seated in state. So the sandals have their own keeper. The king is not supposed to touch the ground, just like the stools. And so the individual who's in charge of the king's shoes gets to wear these. There is fancy adinkra that can be worn for celebration, and this is seen as formal attire. So it's not just for funerals, but that is typically what it has been used for traditionally. And there are hundreds of symbols, old and new. They often represent proverbs. So something like ram's horns could be a symbol of humility or wisdom, knowledge. A ladder can equal death because it is democratic and we all face death. So death is a great equalizer, right? A fern is related to death, but means I'm not afraid of you. All sorts of meanings. And you can see that adinkra is quite varied, right? And you can see that some of these patterns are similar, which again, this is made by stamping, and these are waterproof designs. Okay, this one's a little bit harder to see, but you can see similarities in some of the forms here. Next is kente cloth. So you probably are familiar with kente cloth. It is seen in it's worn by graduates, typically of college, possibly of high school. African-American people will wear this as a sign of cultural heritage and pride. Historically, kente is the cloth of the king, and the Asantehene has traditionally controlled the use and production of kente cloth. So traditionally, it has been reserved for the royal household and officials and political allies of the king, but since then it has become more widespread. And the Ashanti choose kente cloth for their colors and patterns, but also for the names, which are very varied. So kente cloth is made of numerous strips. So let me also see if I have any others. Might show it well. So you can see here that there's a lot of variety. And this is typically woven by men, actually. And they are woven in strips. So each strip here that ends with the edge of the green bar, that is one strip. And so the men would weave these strips very, very long, and then they're cut into shorter lengths and sewn together to create a single cloth. And the cloth is identified primarily by patterns found in the lengthwise or warp threads. But there's often little correlation between the appearance and the name. The names tend to be derived from proverbs or historical events, important chiefs, queen mothers, plants, all sorts of things contribute to this. So kente must be worn so that the stripes are either horizontal or vertical. This is roughly comparable to fancy or formal dress in the West. And it would be wrapped, but again, it must be vertically and horizontally straight. You can't have the stripes askew and going in all different directions. So it must be worn in a specific way in order to be properly displayed. Okay, so, and I've mentioned how the canon of African art history has traditionally been things that are created by men. And although kente cloth is created by men, cloth has traditionally not been considered a part of fine art until relatively recently. So although this is an exception, it is a relatively new addition to the official African art canon. Okay, so just a few other examples of these cloths. And it's frozen for just a second. So I'm going to talk to you about akuba right now, which I think you all will know what akuba are. You've probably seen these. These are extremely popular, and you see them a lot in for instance, Hollywood depictions. So I don't know if anyone has ever seen Frasier. I believe he has an akuba in his apartment. So it is a very recognizable form that is very popular in the West. As you can see, this is a highly abstracted figure. Okay, so Akuba is the singular, the plural would be Akuma. And you can see here how Akuba is spelled. It can have a space between Akua and Ba, or there can be an apostrophe. And what this means is Akua's baby. So Akua was a female who was infertile, and she saw a diviner. So this is someone who can kind of see the future. They can potentially prophesy. They can look into the spirit world and prescribe things for you to do to achieve your end. So she sees a diviner, and the diviner says to have a figure carved and care for it like a child to prove that she is responsible enough to be blessed with a child. So she does this, and the community teases her for doing this, but it works, and she has children. And so this became a tradition. As I mentioned, the Ashanti are a matrilineal society, so it represents a female baby. So you can see that there are very small breasts represented here. And this figure represents idealized beauty. So you have this very large head, the large forehead, right? The small mouth. These are things that we've seen before that have symbolic significance. And this is extremely flat. The head looks almost like a somewhat rounded paddle. They're usually somewhere about like maybe that thick. The head is the most important. The body is much less important, so it tends to be highly abstracted. Sometimes you'll see them wearing bits of clothing or jewelry, as you can see here. The stomach is somewhat emphasized, and you can see the belly button there. The belly button is often seen as a connection to the ancestors, right? So the umbilical cord is a literal thread that connects you to your past. And the body's abstracted. And then with the neck, we see neck rolls, which are a sign of beauty and health and wealth. Again, as we talked about with the Mende Society, although obviously this has a very different use. So they tend to be about 1 to 2 feet tall, and they would be carried around and cared for like a baby. And a woman would commission an Akuba for infertility, and she would care for it like a child until she has had 3 babies. After that point, it becomes unlucky, and it can either be given to the children as a doll, it could be kept at an altar, it could be left at a shrine dedicated to the river god, etc. So what you see here are shrines that have Akuba surrounding them. And this is a really great example of some of the things that we've talked about. So here we have the Akuba, and you can see that it's been given this very elaborate hairstyle. You can see the kente cloth in the strips, okay? And you can see that it is being cared for. So this is not just a ceremonial object. This would be treated as if it were a child. And here you can see how big it is. This one looks a little bit small. They can be a bit bigger. And their forms can vary, but they often have low relief design that's abstract etched into the back of the head. So we're looking at the back of an Akuba here. You can see the ringed neck, the highly abstracted body. Legs aren't even represented. The arms are simply these kind of tubular elements. Again, it's the head that is important. Okay, so here are some other examples of an Akuba. This is also very popular tourist art because it has such a recognizable form and a readily identified meaning. Okay, here you can see that the child has scarification. The face is highly abstracted to create these very elegant formal qualities, highly aesthetic. And then this is a work by an African-American artist from 1970. So you can see the reference to the Akuba. The last thing that I'm going to talk to you about for the Ashanti is a fantasy coffin. So these uh, originated actually not with the Ashanti, my apologies, but in Ghana. So these are from the Ga ethnic group, and these are a social status symbol. And this is literally a coffin, but this would be commissioned before death from a carpenter or a blacksmith, so someone with woodworking skills who potentially has the power to manipulate the energy within objects. And it's a social status symbol. It is ceremonial, and it's seen as a celebration of the life of the person who is entombed within this coffin. And you would be able, the person who commissions one of these would be able to determine the form that it takes. So this is either a cocoa or a coffee pod. And you can see where this lid would lift off, but it is connected to this tree with other similar pods. This was probably originated from the 1930s, and it became an international phenomenon. So these coffins represent the essence of the person who is within them. And they're examples not just of traditional objects, agricultural objects like this cocoa pod or this cow seen here, but also examples of modernity, right? So we see here an example of a plane. You have a shoe, you have plane, you have a Mercedes-Benz, all these things. So think again of similarities between this and the Malian photographers, right? So Malik Sidibe, Seydou Keita, right? So this use of appealing Western formal elements in order to assert your own agency, right? A way of showing your personality and that you are a member of modern society, unlike the stereotypes that often surround Africa. Okay, here's a fish. Mercedes-Benz. Pa Joe is one of the creators of these coffins and is most famous for this. Okay, an onion. So all sorts of things. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is the spirit spouse. So this is from the Ballet, and the Ballet are another subgroup of the Akan language. So they are distantly related to the Ashanti people. However, this is in the Ivory Coast. So, oops, sorry, wrong way. We just looked at Ghana here. And now we're moving a little bit to the left to the Ivory Coast. So this is the Ballet are one of the largest groups in the Ivory Coast, and they're ruled by a main king or a chief. Like the Ashanti, inheritance goes through a matrilineal line. Unlike some of the societies that we have looked at, they have a social order society, one that controls, polices, but there's no collective initiation process like we saw with the Famina or the Mende people. The traditional religion of the Ballet has three realms. So you have God's realm, you have the earthly world, which is where humans, animals, plants, etc. all reside. And then there is the beyond, or the Blolo, which is spelled, let's see, B-L-O-L-O, as you can see here. And this is where the spirits of the ancestors reside. So you have the earthly world, and the Blolo is a parallel universe that exists at both the same time and the same place as the earthly world, but it is invisible. But they are the same age. They have a lot of commonalities. And in the Blolo, or the beyond, everyone has a family. So you have spouse, you have children, and when you're born into the physical world, you leave the beyond, the Blolo, and are missed by those within the Blolo. And generally everything is fine in the physical world until you marry. And at that point, your Blolo spouse becomes jealous, right? So they miss you, they see that you have found a mate in the earthly world, and they become jealous of that mate. They want to be with you. And so if you start to have problems related to health, physical, domestic, financial, anything like that in the physical world, it's probably because your Blolo spouse is jealous. So in order to fix this, you would see a diviner, right? So this is a komian, a blacksmith. So someone who is able to have some amount of prophetic power, but they also are able to manipulate the power within things. And so you would go to see this diviner. And if you are female, you would have a blolo bian, which means male, carved. Or if you were male, you would have a blolo bla carved. And the bla is female. And males are the only ones who can carve these. Blacksmiths can be male or female. So the blacksmiths are able to see into this other world, but only a male could carve this object. So the blacksmith or the komian can see the spouse, but sometimes the client can also see them. So the figure is carved according to both the person who's commissioning it as well as the blacksmith. And that's why you see some are more traditional, some are more contemporary. It's really a matter of taste. When the Europeans first saw the Blolo figures, they thought that they represented nature or ancestor spirits. And while that can be true, some are for nature spirits. Roughly 3/4 of all the Blolo figures are in fact spirit spouses. And so this is more the traditional form of a spirit spouse, like what Europeans would have seen when they first came to the Ivory Coast. So this is a very private art form. They are rarely seen, they're never discussed, and this is a figure who is treated as the physical spouse would be. So you give it offerings, you give it food and gifts, money, blood, alcohol, all of these things. And 1 day a week is reserved for you to sleep not with your physical spouse, but with your Blolo spouse, okay? And this is your ideal spouse. This is an idealized figure. What you would have if you could have a spouse who looked like anything that you wanted. This can cause jealousy for your physical spouse. These are often then hidden under a white sheet, which protects the object from dust, but also wayward glances. So one of your readings talks about the power of vision and of seeing, and how you can take in power with your eyes, right? And so using a sheet protects it from this. While white is also symbolic of purity and the spiritual realm. So you can see here that we have a spirit spouse, a female, who is depicted with some of the offerings that have been given to her, as this is her shrine, essentially, and the white cloth beneath her. So these are objects that are treated with great care. They are very private, idealized. You can see that for the more traditional figures, you have things like the fat rolls on the neck, the large forehead, right? The emphasis on the ancestors with the emphasis on the belly. For this figure from, I think it's early to mid 20th century, you can see that there's this scarification, right? This rather bulbous stomach, the emphasized buttocks and breasts, often having to do with fertility. The soul is often seen as residing in the head or in the stomach in many cultures in Africa. So you often see this emphasis on the stomach as well as the head. But these forms have changed drastically. So here you see a spirit spouse, a Blolo Bla, from 1965. And so this would have been commissioned by a man who has a spirit spouse who looks like this. This is his ideal woman. Interestingly, she is not necessarily someone who has lots of children and is caring for them, but she looks more like a businesswoman, right? She's wearing a rather formal dress. She's carrying a purse. So you can see that there's a lot of variation in what is seen as desirable. Here you have probably jeans and boots and a shirt, but again, right, you have some holdovers with the fat rolls on the neck. So these are incredibly varied. And this is something that is seen as authentic in the older, more traditional forms, right? So this is from 1925, and you can see that this looks a lot like what you might expect to see when you go into a traditional African art gallery. Not all of these are going to be traditional. So even though this is 5 years later than this nude male, it's dressed as a colonial era administrator, okay? And so within the Western canon for African art, this would be seen by a collector as authentic. This is not authentic because it has been tainted by the West, right? And so there's this desire for art that is not tainted by Western civilization, right? There's this desire for these more primal forms that get in touch with your primal spirituality, right? All of these problematic things discussed in the previous lecture. So I'd like you to think about what makes these works authentic. Is it simply that this belief system exists and these are still utilized? Would it be authentic if this belief system was not as prevalent? What would it take for it to be authentic versus inauthentic? Okay, so hopefully that's given you something to think about, and I will talk with you soon.